So the question that I want to address here is whether Ukraine should give up land for NATO membership. This was so this suggestion was made by the NATO General Secretary's subordinate a few weeks ago, and it was easily rejected by Ukraine. It was also something that you hear not directly but indirectly from Russian repeaters. They don't say that they should give up land for NATO, but they should give up land and make peace. Now, that's exactly what Russia wants. It's like a robber who came to your home, grabbed your jewelry and some of your money and maybe a computer and said, no, look, if you don't want me to grab more, if you don't want me to take more of your stuff, you should make peace right now. That's a bad plan. But it's a very complicated issue. It's not a simple issue, and anyone who tells you that it's simple just doesn't understand. Zelensky made a big... he made some waves with this by saying in Denmark, well, we'll trade Belgorod for NATO. And that was actually a really insightful thought. And it of course, RT went nuts with that line. And the reason is they don't own Belgorod. Belgorod's part of Russia. And so it's like they were saying, we're going to take Russian land and trade that for NATO membership. But let's think through the logic of this. Why should Russia be able to snatch up 5 Ukrainian oblasts, including Crimea, and then get to keep it and call that their buffer zone, even though they're calling it part of Russia itself, which means that they need another buffer zone beyond that, according to their own logic. Why shouldn't the aggressor have to, and I'm not advocating for this, but why shouldn't the aggressor, Russia, have to pay with a buffer zone of 5 oblasts around the border of Ukraine? And make that something that is no longer Russia, but is its buffer zone neutral country between NATO and Russia. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying the logic of that seems a lot better when the aggressor cost Ukraine $500 billion, somewhere to $1 trillion worth of damage, let alone the lives that they've destroyed. So if you don't do something like that, if you just give away the land, if you just say, okay, we just want peace at any price, you run into moral hazard. And moral hazard is when you encourage more of that same behavior because you shouldn't have allowed that to begin with. That's a very loose summary of moral hazard, but it's like buying protection from the mafia. You're going to have to buy it again. Or the scenario with the robber who, he came and robbed you, and well, he can come and rob you again if you just had made peace with him. So we're rewarding bad behavior, and we don't want to do that. And it sends a terrible message to other dictators around the world, most notably President Xi of China, who really wants Taiwan, but lesser dictators around the world. If they see that the international community doesn't do anything about wantonly violating international law, they're more likely to try to rip off their neighbor. The second question that we need to address is, what obligations does the government of Ukraine have to her citizens? So the government's primary obligation is to protect her citizens. And so in this case, what about the citizens of Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhia and the other oblasts? So they're under attack, they're being victimized. And if you read the reports of what the Russians do whenever the Russians come in, it'll curl your hair. Right? So they're being victimized. They're taking their children away. I mean, if you just make this peace, do you think that they're going to get these children back? The ones that are being, what Russia is doing is essentially genocidal, maybe loosely genocidal by taking the children and having them adopted somewhere in Russia. But it's still, of a genocidal kind of character. And in order to get justice for how Russia has wronged you, so I saw an interesting news report in the first few hours of the invasion where there was a woman in she was in an underground tunnel hiding from bombings or whatever, and she's saying, look, if I ran a red light or a stop sign and I hit another car and it was my fault, I'm going to jail. The Russians do this with impunity and nothing happens to them. And that's right, they need to pay for what they have done. And just making this peace, giving away land, is not going to provide justice at all. Okay, so you need to have justice, and the Ukraine needs to be ensuring that they get their children back, get justice for the victims. All these things only happen if they win the war, not if they make a peace for land deal. So the next question is a practical question. Will they trade land for peace? And I don't think that they'll do it in the short run. They certainly won't do it anytime in 2023. They feel like they have the ability to carry on the war. And until one side decides that they just can't prosecute the war anymore, then it'll stay on. Russia has no plans of going anywhere. So in the near term, no. 2024, maybe, but probably not likely. 2025, maybe, if the war is still going on. It gets more possible over time. But at the same time, as time goes on, they seem to be getting better and better weapon systems. They'll have an Air Force this time next year, and so they'll have greater ability to be able to prosecute the war, to bring the war to a close in their favor. Western allies really don't want it, but maybe over time they'll get tired, and that's what Putin is counting on, that the Western partners will stop backing them because it's just become too painful over time. And we know it, Putin knows it, Ukrainians know it, and so there is a clock running, but even as the clock runs, Ukraine gets stronger militarily. So the question then becomes, what if they don't? What if they just are not willing to do that? Well, there is a potential for a frozen conflict, and that is possible. It could become a North Korea, South Korea type scenario, or what the Donbass was for the last 8 years or so. But there's also potential for victory if they don't do it. There's potential for victory or this collapse. And for my money, I would see less of a military collapse on the Russian side, more of an economic collapse. And if you look at how war has affected the Soviet Union and Russia before that, it's been very bad, and so that's possible. Okay, now so the next question is, what if they cease fire? Russia is still a threat. If they just stop and say, hey, we're going to make peace, well, what's to stop Russia from violating that peace treaty and coming back again? And that's really one of the great dangers. They can rebuild, they can retool, and at whatever time of their choosing come back, unless or until NATO membership comes into play. So whatever that window is between the peace deal and NATO membership, Ukraine is still in jeopardy. So if they say, okay, you'll join NATO on January 1st of 2025, if Russia invades on Christmas of 2024, it's back on and they can't join NATO. So that's a big problem. So what if they give away the land for NATO? Well, they'll never get that land back. It's permanently part of Russia, and Russia wins. Moral hazard. It's all bad. They can't get it back because that would be NATO attacking Russia, and Russia can't go forward because that would be Russia attacking NATO. Although they'll saber rattle about how, and they'll perpetually have this argument about how NATO keeps encroaching on them and that kind of thing. So the long and short is, Russia has to be beaten in order to pay reparations for what they have done. And unless you have done that, there's still great danger that looms. Of course, it's possible to give away the land and NATO membership immediately in the same deal. It's unlikely that would happen, but it's immediate. Its immediacy would be necessary to be there, but the safest course of action is just not to give away land. And I know that that's painful, but it's kind of like any other process in life. Sometimes you have to go through hard times in order to get to where you want to be. When you have a problem with a tooth and the doctor the dentist has to go in and do something to it, you don't like the immediate pain, but you want the long-term relief. And I think that that's the kind of scenario that Ukraine is in right now. Okay, those are my thoughts on trading land for NATO protection. I think it's a fool's errand. They shouldn't do it. I'm not Ukraine, but as long as they decide that they want to prosecute the war, I think it's our obligation to equip them and help them. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to this. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.